My name is Otto Neals. I worked at the Brooklyn Post Office for 36 years. First as a clerk, and then I joined the art department, first as a sign painter, and then finally an illustrator, and before I retired, I was the head illustrator. I was born in Lake City, South Carolina. Lake City is the home of the astronaut, Dr. Ronald McNair, the same hometown, small town, about 6,000 people. I arrived here in New York, I think I was about 4 years old when I arrived here. I think the year was 1935. My parents were Gus and Della Neals. And they both, I suppose, were farmers. There was no other work for them during those days. So they worked on the farm, raising cotton, tobacco, and corn, and other products to sell on the market. When my family, mother and father, arrived in New York City, my father worked first, well, he was a barber. He cut hair, and then he wound up becoming a longshoreman. And my mother was domestic. None of my family had any talent, artistic talent, as far as I know. They never exhibited any. But there's a story about that. All my life I thought one of my cousins, David, used to care for me when I was a child in South Carolina. He was older than I. I think he was 8 years older. But while my parents were working, he would care for me. There was an attachment there with, to David. And when I was always asked about who was my influence regarding my art, I would always say, oh, David. I used to, look over his shoulder while he was drawing and painting. And that went on. In fact, that's been published in books and publications and so on. Elton Fax even wrote about it in a book called Black Artists of a New Generation. And it just so happened that after David left New York, went back to the South, built a house, and in Hemingway, South Carolina. I went there to visit, and I handed him this book by Elton Fax. I said, hey, David, here's something in here about you, about me learning how to draw by watching you. And he read it. He says, what are you talking about? I never drew. So I concluded by that I probably dreamt that I used to watch him draw. And I took it to be real, and I passed that on, forever, because it went on until I was an adult, But it wasn't true. David never drew or painted. I went to high school in Brooklyn. In fact, the high school at that time was called Brooklyn High School for Specialty Trades. It was later to be called George Westinghouse Vocational High School. And it was there that I met the artist Tom Feelings, although I was a class or two ahead of him, I think. But we had some joint art classes. And there was also the infamous Joey Gallo, who he and I graduated at the same time in 1949. My first job coming out of high school was for working in a factory. I think I was making the ironing boards, something like that, And after that, I went on probably maybe a $5 raise or something like that. I went on to Palace Metal Works, and I was making kitchen cabinets. and I was doing what was called spot welding, welding, the metal, together, to make the cabinets, cutting and making the cabinets out of tin. Yes. One of my cousins was working in the post office, and he had suggested I take the tests. I had ignored him for a while, but after a while, I decided to check it out. And I took the test, and I was accepted into the post office department. And I was a clerk. I worked as a clerk for a year or so before I was drafted into the military. And after the military, I went back to the post office. I went in as a private, and after a while, I got a promotion, a corporal, and before I left the military, I was a sergeant. I have to mention something about how I got to be in the military. When I found out that I was going to be drafted, this was during the Korean War, I didn't want to go into the Army. So I decided to go join the Air Force. I went down to the recruiting office and I applied, and they asked me, where's your birth certificate? And I said, I don't have a birth certificate. I was born in South Carolina, and during those days, birth certificates were difficult to get. And so I didn't have a birth certificate. So anyhow, I was told I couldn't join the Air Force. But lo and behold, they still accepted me into the military, into the Army, without a birth certificate. So I thought that was very, very strange. The same U.S. military, but they wouldn't accept me without a birth certificate for the Air Force, but they drafted me without a birth certificate for the U.S. Army. And in the U.S. Army, I went from a private up to a sergeant, and I was a sergeant when I was let go after I served my 2 years. I had worked in the post office, prior to being drafted, so I went back to working in the post office, and I applied for. I heard that they had an art department there, and I applied for it, and it was after waiting 7 years. It was 7 years before I was actually accepted into the department. And it appears there was some attempts to just ignore me, because I found out later, after being accepted into the department, that there were some of those working there that had no artistic talent at all. But and I had seniority over most of them, but they were accepted into the department, and and I was ignored. And this I found out after I was able to get into it. And I think the powers that be reluctantly let me in because they didn't want to be accused of, something that wasn't nice. Early on, I was able to latch on to a group that was being formed, I think 1958. Ernie Critchlow and Jacob Lawrence were contacted by a woman by the name of Shirley Hawkins, a businesswoman in the community. And she realized that there was a tremendous amount of talent. And she thought that Jake Lawrence and Ernie would be able to help gather together artists for exhibitions and, for let people in the community know what was going on artistically. And so that's how the Fulton Art Fair was formed. And that was 1958. And during those days, we got some artists that would have become very, very notable over the years. Ernie Critchlow, Jacob Lawrence, of course, Al Hollingsworth, Richard Mayhew, Tom Feelings, and quite a few others that made names in the world of art. The purpose of the Fulton Art Fair was to have a space for artists with talent to show, because they weren't accepted in other spaces. And like I said, excuse me, Shirley Hawkins was largely responsible for this. During those days, and this is coming after the Fulton Art Fair, in the early 60s, there was a group of artists that got together and decided to form a group, and they were called the 20th Century Creators. And the creators, at that time, perhaps there was maybe 30 or 40 artists in that group. And over time, you know, a year or so, squabbles and whatnot, the group broke into two parts. One way, the other went the other way. I went with the group that went that way, that was to become the Weusi artists. And in the beginning, there was maybe about 7 or 8 artists that began in the Weusi, and 5 of us. There was Rudy Irvin, Thomas Duval, G. Falcon Biza, Abdul Aziz, and myself. And we founded a gallery which we call Nyumba ya Sanaa, which is a Swahili term for the House of Art. And that was located at 158 West 132nd Street in Manhattan. And we were there for perhaps about 10 years until we were forced, due to Mother Nature intruding upon the space in terms of a flood. So we have left that space, and for about a year or so we didn't have any location. But then we hooked up with a group in the Lincoln Center area on West 62nd Street, the Richard Allen Dance Theater, and another group, and the Weusi artists. And we were there for about 2 years or so before we found that the traffic that we had up in Harlem was far greater than the traffic that we had in the Lincoln Center area, even though it was prime space. So, but we were there for about 2 years before we broke up. But as a group, we usually still stayed together, but putting on shows when we were invited into other spaces. But we didn't have a space of our own at that time. In Brooklyn, there was a gallery. I was on St. Mark's Avenue in Brooklyn, and Verdell Standard and Eduardo Standard and Verdell Standard, they operated this gallery on St. Mark's Avenue near Brooklyn Avenue, I believe. And that was there for a while. It was very, it attracted artists from all over. A very well-known artist, Harvey Dinnerstein, who wrote several books and whatnot. I recall him showing there during those days. And then there was a couple other galleries. I can't recall the names, but 1 or 2 other galleries, small galleries, opened up where we were able to show our works. Around 1970, I met a friend of mine told me about this gallery on Rogers Avenue in Brooklyn, and she's Dorsey's, and she told me, she'd like me to meet him, and I kept putting it off finally one during the Fulton Art Fair, she brought Dorsey by, and Dorsey came by and said, "Hey, fella, why don't you come by and see, you know?" So I finally did, and it was one of the best things I've ever done in the art world, because I found that Dorsey, I might mention that he was a framer, but he wanted to get business from me as far as framing, but also to allow me to hang my work in his space, which I did. And so that went on for, from about 1970 up until the present, until he passed about 15 years ago. But he was a wonderful person, and it was through Dorsey's that I got a chance to meet Elizabeth Catlett and Joseph Delaney, and and a bunch of other notable artists that passed through Dorsey's space. And he seemed to be like a magnet, because people would come, Elizabeth Catlett would come in from Mexico, and then she would head for Dorsey's, and then Ed Clark would show up there, and Tom Feelings, and Ernie Critchlow, and Vincent Smith, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful space. Dorsey's was, behind it all. In fact, I did a piece of sculpture, a bronze sculpture of Dorsey, which I call the High Priest of the Arts. Because Dorsey had some magic about him, and it seemed that a lot of artists just gravitated towards him. He didn't, high pressure anybody, but he was just smooth, and people just liked, being around him and being in that space. And Dorsey's, did a wonderful job in attracting artists. I have works in Smithsonian, the Library of Congress. 2 libraries in Ghana have works of mine. But also, I got commissioned to do work. I have a life-size sculpture at the Brooklyn Children's Center, and also the main one. In fact, I got a full-page article with my photo and whatnot in the New York Times with when they installed my piece called Peter and Willie. And Peter and Willie is a sculpture of a little boy, and it's worked. The sculpture is based on the works of Ezra Jack Keats, and I was contacted by the foundation to commission to do the work, and I'm told that I beat out 80 other competitors, for the commission, and it's about the best thing the most notable thing that I've done, Peter and Willie. But I have a 20-foot mural in Kings County Hospital. I have 10 bronze plaques in the Library of Congress, the Harlem Walk of Fame. It's a sculpture of notables, Bojangles, Charlie Parker, Machito, Langston Hughes, and so on. These are bronze plaques in the sidewalk along 132nd Street and 7th Avenue. And I have a 7-foot by a 9-foot by 12-foot piece at the Newark switching station. That's in Newark, New Jersey. The biggest show that I've had was at the Columbia Museum in South Carolina. But I've shown at other spaces like the Museum of Natural History here in New York, the Brooklyn Museum. I've been in 3 shows there, and I just found out that a replica of the Peter and Willie sculpture found its way into the collection of the International African Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. I assume that the Martin Pope, who was the head of the Ezra Jack Heaps Foundation, must have donated it to them, because I can't think of any other way. Yes, but it's just a small replica of the Peter and Willie sculpture. I managed to travel a bit, so I have works that I've created in South Carolina, Jamaica, Dominica, Ghana, and so on. So each place, whenever I travel, I generally travel with my little watercolor set, and so I can work. Now, some I work directly, but others I work from sketches I've created. Watercolors, to me, was the hardest. It was extremely hard for me to get into. It took me quite a while before I was able to work in watercolors. It seemed that my early works were more in watercolor, was more like oil paintings. I wasn't pleased with them at all, so I put aside the watercolors. But I loved it so much that I kept trying and trying, and I finally found a way to work it, in a medium that satisfies me, So I'm happy, to be able to do and create a body of work in watercolors now. And it's one of my favorite mediums, although I can't say that it's my best medium, because whenever I'm asked, what do I like best, what medium, I would say whatever I happen to be working in, whether it's wood, stone, bronze, oils, watercolors, oils, or pastels, or whatever. But watercolors is there, I love it. This piece, which I call Yellow Turban, was created back in 1983. It was done of a young lady that used to come into our gallery space when we had it in Harlem, on 132nd Street. And I can't remember her name, but I know that she was a wonderful model, and I enjoyed rendering this piece. This is one I think I did down in Maryland. Sonia Sadler and I was invited down by Sonia Sadler's family to spend a couple of days down there. And Sonia and I used to go out in the woods looking for spaces to paint. And this is one of this house with the red barn is one of those I painted during those times. This piece here from Dominica shows an image I have of David Wilson, a fellow artist's mother, coming back from the sea, which is very, very scenic. Dominica is very, very scenic. I love it there. The houses, the space, the hills and the water, just a fantastic place. I used to try to play the horn, so I love seeing the musicians, and I took a lot of joy in painting this piece here, as well as some of the other musical images. And this is on the horn, and I can just feel myself trying to play, which I couldn't, Yeah. This is one of my favorite pieces. I call it White Stripe Blues. I don't know why, but this is down in South Carolina, St. Helena. I think it's St. Helena. I think that's off the coast of Beaufort, where they had this performance. Yeah, I remember painting this in Ocho Rios in Jamaica, It's not too far from the hotel where I stayed, and I just sat out there and I painted this beautiful scene. Jamaica is one of my favorite spots, and it seems to have just about everything all the other islands or tropical spaces have. Jamaica has them and more. It's one of my favorite spots. Beautiful.